Hello and welcome to another biology lesson. Today we're going to be talking about the theory of evolution by natural selection. So honestly, we've been talking about evolution by natural selection for a while now. I just haven't explicitly said that's what we were studying. You probably have figured that out already on your own. But today we're actually going to get into it and talk about what it is. First, let's kind of recap what we have done so far. So we first talked about natural selection, and we saw that within any population there is variety, and some variations are going to be better than others. And so the individuals that have better traits are more likely to survive and pass on those alleles, pass on those traits. And so over time, we'd expect more of the population to get those more favorable traits. We also know that there's a process of mutations that are constantly creating new variations. And so you combine those two things, and you get that there are constantly new variations being made, and the more favorable variations are the ones that are getting passed on, and you could get to where the population changes over time, which we've also looked at with reproductive isolation, could possibly cause two different populations to be changing separately and eventually form two separate species. And we also looked at, of course, disease resistance, where bacteria can change over time to become resistant to antibiotics. And so this is the core idea behind the theory of evolution by natural selection, that you would have populations that change over time, and given enough time, you would say that a population that we have now is really a completely different species than the one that it started at back in the past, if you go back far enough. Not only do they change over time, but these populations will become isolated from each other, and so populations will diverge and form multiple different species as time progresses. And so the idea then is, if you go back far enough, since we're diverging and forming multiple species, we're going to see common ancestors. And so we might see that all cats have a common ancestor. Or we might go back even further and see, hey, all mammals have a common ancestor. And go back even further, we might say, well, all animals have a common ancestor. And going back even further, just all living things have a common ancestor. And that's the idea of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And so it's worth reviewing at this point the difference between a theory and a law and a hypothesis. So hypotheses are often created, both at the beginning and at the end of an experiment. You've made some kind of observation, you've done some kind of study. Let's say you've linked obesity with diabetes. Sorry. Let's say you've linked, I don't know why I couldn't remember that. Let's say you've linked obesity with diabetes. You would say, okay, we've seen there's a link there. Now you might create a hypothesis as to why there is a link. And you would have to do another experiment to see if that reason why is the reason. Or you might come up with a hypothesis that if people lose weight, their diabetes will get better. You wouldn't know that that's true without actually creating a new study where you have people lose weight and see what happens. And so that's a hypothesis. A law, on the other hand, is going to be an observation. It's going to be something we observe to be true. We see it to be true. We don't necessarily know why it's true or how it works, but we observe it to be true. And so my favorite example for that comes from physics. It's the law of gravity. We know that gravity, how it behaves. We have equations that explain how strong force of gravity is, but we don't know why there is gravity. A lot of recent experiments with the Large Hadron Collider is kind of getting us closer to understanding why, but fundamentally, until very recently, we didn't really know why. We didn't really have an explanation for how it worked or why it existed. But we definitely had a law that said this is how it behaves. Theory, on the other hand, is going to try to take observations things that we know to be true, experimental results, and explain why those occurred. Tries to tie them together to explain why we got these results. So in this case, the big thing that Darwin observed that he tried to explain was multiple things, but kind of the poster child of it, or the main inspiration is said to be the Galapagos finches, where he sees there's on these islands finches that are using adapted to different niches within it, but they all are very similar, while also very having these differences that allow them to use different parts of the environment. And so they're all clearly closely related, or appeared to be closely related. They all appeared to be finches, but they also had these differences. And so he thought, well, what would explain that? And the idea being that, well, what would explain that observation that he's seen is that if they had a common ancestor and there was some process that changed them over time and allowed different groups to diverge to form different species. And so that leads to the theory of evolution by natural selection. Now, the key thing about a theory, if it's so theories can change. They can, as we get more information, they can be changed or even replaced. But it is important to know that they are based on evidence. And the other key thing about a theory then is that as we gather more evidence, if the theory is good, if it's the correct, if it's the correct explanation, then as we gain more evidence, more observations, those other observations should also be explained by the theory. Or the theory should make predictions about other observations that we should be able to make. And so I'm going to give one example of this. We looked at last week vestigial structures. So vestigial structure is a structure that an organism has that has shrunken to a point that it's not usable. So a couple examples of that is you'll see whales with hip bones and leg bones, even though those bones they don't have legs. In humans, we have the appendix, which is an organ that has shrunken so much that it's not used anymore. And so how would that be explained? Well, evolution by natural selection would explain that by saying, hey, we had some common ancestor, that had that trait, that had a large appendix that did something. And over time, we diverged. Maybe there's a population somewhere that still has that large appendix, and there's some other population, humans don't, right? And so it has shrunk over time because we had an ancestor that had it, and over time we have changed to no longer have a large appendix. As time goes on, we expect the appendix possibly to even get smaller, but honestly there's not a lot of benefit to making it even smaller, because at this point they rarely become infected, and even when they do, modern medicine makes it to where they can be removed. So there's not a strong elimination of people with that trait. Anyway, I'm digressing. None of that was all that last little bit wasn't that important. So that's kind of what I'm asking you to do for this assignment. Next assignment is to go back and look at those pieces of evidence that are in the book, and kind of like I just did for vestigial structures, explain how those relate to this theory, are explained by this theory, and support this theory. Or and you can use vestigial structures because you're gonna have to do a couple. So there you go, you got a freebie. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions. Take care, and thanks for watching.